Really excited to be hosting this evening through Amos Eno Gallery and through the artist Heidi Neff, who's here with us, and our panelists. The event, the long goodbye reflections on a divided country. So this panel features artist Heidi Neff, who you may know, whose solo show, The Long Goodbye, is on view right now at Amos Eno Gallery, where I am currently. So for this evening, we have on our panel, the artist herself is with us, Elifnaz Caliskan, MPP, Stephanie Hallock, PhD, and Regina Roof Ray, MED. So my name is Audra Lambert, and I am the director of Amos Eno Gallery. We're excited to host this program this evening in conjunction with Heidi Neff's solo show. So with that being said, this panel is related to the current solo show that's by Heidi Neff here at the gallery. So the artist will be sharing the animation that is the central core of the exhibition with us shortly this evening as well. And I will allow her to introduce that work when she's about to share it with everyone. So in the meantime, I just wanted to talk to you very quickly about Amos Eno Gallery and to introduce our wonderful panelists that are here this evening. So Amos Eno Gallery is a member-run nonprofit art gallery, and we provide a full season of exhibitions by emerging and mid-career artists who work across a range of media, including visual, performance art, installation, interactive, and new media as well. Our season is complemented also through a diverse series of performances and programs, as well as educational and public presentations for New Yorkers and in light of the COVID pandemic on the virtual space as well. So a small community of professional artists runs our nonprofit, and our members are selected through a rigorous reviewing process. We've also been around since the year 1974. We started in Soho and are one of the original artist-run spaces in New York City. So that being said, we did mention that we provide a full season of exhibitions and programs, and we have our current solo show up here, which is Heidi Neff's show, The Long Goodbye, through Sunday the 14th. So feel free to visit. We are open from noon to 6 p.m. We are located in New York. We're in Brooklyn. So if you're not here, then you will see the animation shortly. But if you happen to either live here or happen to be visiting, you are welcome to come by. The press release for this show, I should mention, is also available on our website, which is Amos Eno, and it has a .org ending because we are a nonprofit. So amoseno.org. It is the current exhibition on our website. So all that being said, the themes and the show currently on view are what lead us to the subjects for tonight's panel. So this panel will reflect on our current state as a nation that is still reeling from the effects of the past few months and what is happening. As we know right now, the impeachment is in progress in the Senate as well. So we have a lot to talk about this evening. So I will go ahead and introduce the panel topics and our panelists. So what has happened here? Why is the country so divided? Some say even on the brink of a civil war. After viewing Heidi Neff's animated feature, animated short, I should say, The Long Goodbye, a personal documentary of the time in between Election Day 2020 and Inauguration Day 2021, the artist will speak on themes that are present in the project in this panel. So I've already introduced everyone according to their name, but I'll give a short bio. Just quickly, themes for tonight's conversation will include the political spectrum of opinion, so our divisiveness, how we are living through a party realignment, which is a rare occurrence in American history, and how phenomena including cognitive inflexibility, confirmation bias, and misinformation affect our current situation. So that being said, it is a wonderful pleasure to introduce our panelists this evening. I'll start with artist Heidi Neff, who's a professor of art and design at Harvard Community College in Bel Air, Maryland, where she was granted a sabbatical to work on animation for the spring semester of 2020. So the artist makes apocalyptic animations with a hand-drawn and hand-painted aesthetic. She earned her MFA from the University of Iowa and her BFA from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So next we have Elifnaz Caliskan, MPP, who's a senior project manager at an international development firm focused on providing expertise in conflict and post-conflict countries. She holds particular interest in the role that negotiations and diplomacy and human capital investment can hold in conflict prevention and transformation. She's a native of Turkey. She's lived across 8 cities around the globe on 3 continents and is currently located in Washington, D.C. She's a proud alumna of the University of Maryland for her MPP and her BA as well. She sees herself as a storyteller and aspires to help marginalized communities to tell their stories. We have two more panelists. So next we have Professor Regina Roof Ray, who's an associate professor of psychology at Hartford Community College, also along with Heidi in Maryland. Roof Ray brings her expertise in social psychology and will explore how phenomena such as personality, cognitive inflexibility, confirmation bias, and misinformation affect people. She has presented at several local and also national conferences, including the National Institute on the Teaching of Psychology, and was a founding organizer of the Mid-Atlantic Undergraduate Psychology Conference. She holds a BA in behavioral science from Messiah College, and she studied at Temple University and also at the Daystar University in Nairobi, Kenya, and holds an MED in counseling from Millersville University. And last but not least, we have here this evening Dr. Stephanie Hallock, who earned her PhD at the University of Miami and has spent over 20 years trying to help others understand the glorious mess that is American democracy. She is a professor of political science at Hartford Community College in Maryland. So that being said, I'm happy to hand the mic over to Heidi Neff to show us her animation.
Hi, so this animation is a piece that was born out of kind of a need to come up with, well, I had this, as was said, I was on sabbatical to learn animation in the spring of 2020, and I was working on several different animated shorts that are actually still in progress. A lot of them came to a standstill or slowed down a lot because of the pandemic, because of the things that go along with the pandemic, namely children and learning to teach online fully when I had not done that before. But having this show scheduled, it just happened to turn out that we moved the exhibit back to, because of the pandemic, back to the day after the inauguration. And before the election, I was thinking, what on earth am I going to do? What is the mood of the country going to be? I had some pieces that were a little more political and some that were very personal, but I really had no idea, you know, what I wanted to focus on that would make sense on January 21st, 2021. So I came up with the idea to do a short animation, which was every day, starting on election day and ending on Inauguration Day, which is a lot of work, by the way. So I did that and did a little editing to put it together, but it is mostly those pieces strung together from each day through that time, and just me reflecting on my experience daily. So I will share my screen now and play the animation. It is about 6.5 minutes long. I'm not.
Yeah, so thank you, Heidi, for sharing that with us. And it just looks so incredible to see it on the screen and so powerful to share this experience of watching it together, and helps to put a lot of things into context for the panel, which we can start that portion now. So I had a note here to maybe start with this question to Professor Roof Ray, but it is open to everyone. So anyone on the panel that feels that they want to chime in, please feel free. This is a very open forum for dialogue. So starting with question 1, why don't we talk about how the long goodbye, which we just witnessed, is a snapshot of what happened in the US and also internationally from the 3rd of November through to the inauguration. So as seen through the filter of the artist, if you knew little of the news, but perhaps you watched this, what conclusions would you draw about the state of the world?
So I watching it again, I first of all kind of marveled that I see something new each time. See something a little different each time. I don't know if it really was the Wittenberg door, but this time around I'm like, oh, it's the Wittenberg door. I get it. It was just, was it the Wittenberg door, Heidi? I don't know. I was especially struck this time through by Twitter, Google, United States flag. You know, I grew up memorizing the flag rules. But in terms of the actual question, the world is in a state of high emotional reactivity. There's confusion, there's pain. I think in the animation we saw hope, we saw hurt. It comes from, and it leads to insensitivity, to frustration, to struggle, to judgment, to intolerance. And one image, I think, representing one event can bring joy to one and pride to another. To one individual, it could bring sadness, to another frustration, and yet to another joy. So I think the conclusions you can draw from this, though the emotion may be different for each individual, it's a very emotional time. That's what I have.
Yeah, does anyone else want to sort of add in what are some of the experiences that perhaps you pulled through watching this, that if you perhaps weren't watching the news but saw this, how would you respond?
Yeah, one thing that was a striking image for me is the flags for the corporations that, you know, how I think it's a reflection of how the concept of citizenship transformed into customer. So we're not citizens, we're customers now. So that several images within the animation captured it like very interestingly.
So I was just going to add to that I feel that's especially poignant if you think about the fact of like seeing Trump as businessman. That's a really interesting kind of form of juxtaposition. Were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to, I was looking at Heidi and I'm thinking it must be weird to sit here and you've poured your heart and soul and emotion, you know, everything into this. And so now you're hearing other people kind of tell you what they see in it. And is it even what you were thinking or intended? But I think that's kind of, I mean, for me, that's kind of the point about how you kind of get through these times when there's so much division, which is you pour your heart and your soul into figuring out how you feel, you express it, whether in whatever form. It's why we have the First Amendment, right? So you express it, and people are going to see what they want to see. People are going to read what they want to read. People are going to hear what they want to hear. And it goes back to Regina's point about insensitivity. Everything that isn't what I believe is now a challenge to what I believe. It can't just be. It has to be a challenge or a competition. But I'd be anxious to hear what Heidi thinks about what we all think.
Yeah, same.
Well, I was just, since two people brought up the flags. I mean, I'm really glad that you did, because like with that one, it was very much just this feeling of, on the one hand, relief that Trump was no longer on Twitter, but then on the other hand, there's this huge sense of this huge, like, shadowy doom out there that now not now, it's been going on for a long time, but that we live in this world in this country where corporations can decide who is allowed to speak, and they can silence the president. And that's great when you really don't like the president or what he's saying and when he's inciting violence, but that's not a great position to be in as a country, to have corporations in charge at all.
Yeah, and oops. Yeah, for me, that's particularly striking because my favorite image was the Oval Office with the chair spinning. And then you put that with the flags and you're like, well, yeah, right.
Right, like someone is in charge actually, but
right, exactly. The girl's saying no one's in charge, the chair's spinning around, but the Google flag is proudly flying. So
yeah, somebody is.
Something that I was thinking, the combination of the sound and images, that's the echo chamber that was created through social media and everything that we were just talking about. When you follow everybody that you only follow people that you think that they think like you, and then the algorithm actually finds those people for you too. And so slowly but slowly, that classic frog example, you increase it by 1 Fahrenheit every time, and then you get to a point where the frog doesn't feel like it's boiling. It's exactly like that. We slowly but surely became set down in this echo chamber, and any other idea wasn't welcome without us realizing. So when I was listening to the sound, and there was a lot of echo, and then a lot of thin sound. So I don't know. It was a really good combination.
Yeah, and I think to that point, it's like we've each kind of assimilated to the soundtrack, right? Like we hear the same things over and over again. It becomes like a theme or like a motif that you hear in a film over and over again. If you're on one side, you hear the same kind of noises. If you're on another side, you hear the same noises. I think too of like the idea of a dog whistle, right? Where someone's sort of like prompted to react a certain way. And I think this is a great segue actually to our next theme, which is what is a person's filter, so to speak, and how does it, one, affect how they see the world, and then two, affect the world as a whole. Whoever wants to tackle that one. I kind of want to throw it to Professor Roof Ray again, since I feel like that's your field for sure.
So, it kind of obvious, I guess, but our filter is our lens that we use to interpret things. We sense things, they come to back to the days of Barney, our 5 senses, and we can sense the same sound, but how we interpret it, how we perceive it is what gives us the differences. Our perceptions are a product of our own past experiences, how we were raised, our culture, our values, our attitudes, our beliefs. And interestingly, it's also somewhat genetic. We actually have a genetic predisposition towards our religious beliefs, our political affiliations. But even if we have a genetic predisposition to go one direction, it's still influenced by the environment. Back to nature versus nurture. I could take 2 Hershey Kisses, same ingredients, put one in the oven, one in the freezer, come up with 2 different products. It's the same with our lens or our perception. We present our view, which influences others. At the same time, it becomes part of our experience. It becomes part of their experience. And this happens both in not just what we present, but how we present it. And so our lens is very much a product of that influence. That's what I got.
Yeah, does anyone else want to weigh in on sort of the idea of a lens, and then, I mean, also how it affects sort of all of us in this realm together?
I mean, it's a really difficult, I don't know if I 100% buy into this, but I think more and more evidence is telling me to believe it. But Gustav Holberg once said, there's no truth but perception. So I don't know if I buy the first part where there's no truth, but I think definitely the perception creates that truth. And that's how we became, the popular conversation about fake news came along too, didn't it? So everybody had their own truth, and there were a lot of images about the vaccination and whatnot. I think that was the biggest conversation, how perception is not just a concept. It's not just, a philosophy or whatnot. It actually has real life, day-to-day impact, right? So I think that's becoming more and more prevalent. And people started thinking about it too. I think that's the hope that I have, that people, at least, some stopped and realized that, oh, there are these walls that are created, there are these lenses. So that's the only hope that I can, because the only reason that you can see outside of that lens is that you realize that you have a lens. I think that's the biggest challenge. A lot of us don't realize that we are either predispositioned or several impacts that create that lens. But I think the first step is to realize that there's a lens.
Yeah, and when we talk about filter in political science, we are talking about a very conscious act that the media of any sort, whether it's social media, whether it's TV news, whether it's newspaper, whatever, anyone who's giving you information, filter is what they, how they prepare you to receive what it is you're going to receive, what it is they're about to give you. And it's a very intentional, conscious thing, which I think is kind of different than what Regina was saying about our own personal, right? Which is kind of partially genetic, partially, internal and product of our experiences. And yet, so we have our own, and then literally what we're getting is being filtered coming to us.
So one thing to add to that, is like in diplomacy, for example, right? The second track diplomacy, like not the official statewide diplomacy, but what I studied was second track diplomacy, which is citizens trying to find common ground. And one thing that you have to realize is when you're trying to find common ground, if you do, is people have different identities, right? And then one person can have multiple. And the trick to finding that common identity is to realize that you have a filter and then try to expand that filter. And then the third step on that is, because it expanded now, it can have a commonality with more people. So let's say I have several identities, right? I can identify by my religion, my ethnicity, my language, my status as a, sister, mother. I have that relation. And the more I realize and talk about those different identities, different lenses, and I, expand that, then I realize you're a mother too. But if I was coming at it in a national perspective or, political identity or conservative versus liberal, then we don't talk about it. But if we are both moms, then we might be able to talk. So it's important to realize that lens exists.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if everyone here is on mute, but I'm just going to remind you, we are going to have some questions at the end, so feel free to add them into the chat, but we will address them after. Heidi, I wanted to ask you sort of expanding on what we heard from Elifnaz. Do you feel as though while you're making this animation, were you having to sift through the different say aspects of your identity, or like even as we heard from Dr. Hallock, like were you having to navigate these different sort of media biases? Because I know you were doing this every day, and we change from hour to hour, from sort of day to day, right? And then also I think about halfway through, I forget exactly when, but you had two screens where you had two different kind of like news media lenses, like scrolling across each of them. So how did you navigate all the different streams of sort of lenses that you were then having in this animation project?
Yeah, I mean, in that one scene that you're talking about, there's like a woman in the front looking at her laptop and a man or somebody in the back like on a couch, and there's a TV. And I honestly, I made sure to pick like the worst of the media when you look at one of those charts that says like, what are they called? But the media bias charts. I made sure not to pick anything that was actually like in the middle and considered by reasonable people to be news, because I wanted to show that it's not, it's not just one side that is getting false information, that we're kind of at a point with this echo chamber that you were talking about where people are just bringing in all of this garbage that, fits what we want to believe and what we want to see. Because I mean, I can definitely identify when I see a news article or hear an opinion that doesn't fit my worldview, but it comes from somebody really smart and, who's read a lot about the subject. It's hard, right? It's hard to say like, wait, let me look at this again. Let me think about it. So I did want to reflect that in the piece, even though obviously the whole thing's going to be biased because it's my reactions every day. But I mean, that's something that I think about a lot. And I don't know if that part, except for that little moment, came through, if I had a way to get that through in the animation. But I think a lot about what Elifnaz was talking about in terms of, you have to have some kind of empathy and connection, and people saying like, well, how, like taking January 6th for an example, the events that day, you have to, for me, like, it's unfathomable that happened until you start thinking, well, these are the media sources that you are watching. These are the things that you believe to be the facts in the situation. You have a president whose election, you have a stolen election. You have someone coming in who is not legally, that's what they're thinking, and they feel like they've been told to go and fight, and they're willing to give their life for, to stop a stolen election, to preserve democracy, whereas everyone else is sitting there saying like, this is the end of democracy. But to have, but you can have empathy to say like, oh, you're doing that for that reason. You're doing that because you care about democracy. I mean, it's messed up.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we could spend all night kind of perhaps on like maybe a tangent about media. So I think to center it again on the Trump administration, so this was an administration that really pushed the boundaries, so to speak, of maybe like having more of a dignified historical precedent that so much of our usual everyday government processes function by. So will these past 4 years, or even just the events of the 6th of January that Heidi mentioned when so-called protesters stormed the Capitol, is this going to redefine the role of the US government with relation to its people, to the constituency of the US? And I think I'll throw that one to Dr. Hallock, if you want to chime in.
Yeah, so it's does it change the relationship? I think the first thing that the Trump administration did was make us all acutely aware just how much our government, our system of democracy, rests on concepts and notions, right? Concept of rule of law. That's great until someone doesn't follow the law, right? Until people don't believe that the law is the law. Well, that's your law, but that's not my law. Then what's rule of law? We talk about, the historical, much of the way that particularly our presidents, particularly the executive branch functions, is by precedent, right? For example, until after Franklin Roosevelt, there was no limitation on term limits for presidents, but every single man who had the job after 2 terms said, you know what? George Washington said 2 terms was enough. He was tired. I'm done. I'm good. I'm not better than George Washington, so I'm out. And it wasn't until Franklin Roosevelt and of course extraordinary times, that changed and becomes concretized. But just the way the president, and you would say, well, can the president really say that? But that's the president saying that. Yeah, but he has a First Amendment right. Does he? That's the president saying that. Like, those words matter. They weigh more than other people's words. So, and they make things okay. And that can be used for good, or it can be used, for bad. And I think all presidents to some extent are acutely aware of that and do that. I'm going to use my words for good, or, to convey comfort or hope after 9/11, or, whatever the situation is that they're coming to. So it's a power. I think if the relationship changes, it's because we, the people, again, on all sides, recognize just how few guardrails there are in the Constitution, and how much we rely on good people to do the right thing. And we probably shouldn't anymore. Probably never should have.
Yeah, I realize this is like a heavy topic, but it is really central to this animation. So Heidi, do you kind of want to speak through the lens of like your everyday kind of witnessing this happening day by day and unfolding?
Sure. I think the initial question had to do with do the events of January 6th fundamentally change how our and I don't know. That's not my area, but I do think a lot depends on what happens from here on out and how we react to January 6th. And as a country, and I have had very mixed feelings about the impeachment, in terms of, I guess, should we bother? Because it doesn't look like he will be convicted, and it might be a distraction from getting other work done. But watching, that was maybe before, I've been watching it, not in its entirety, but I've been watching it, and I am much more on board with it right now. But I do think that, I think that's crucial. If the majority of the Republican Party ignores what happened and kind of sanctions it in their actions after this, something's going to happen to the Republican Party. I'm not sure what, but things will change. Things will change drastically from here on out. And so I'm not really sure what that means, but I would defer to the experts here.
But I think that goes back to the question about, or we talked in the flyer or the intro about realignment and party realignments, and factions and caucuses within parties. I think Audra put a flyer, like an infographic, basically, of political polarization in the chat. If anyone just kind of wants a basic understanding of what that looks like it's a visual of what that actually looks like right now. But I think when we talk about, so parties, political parties, we have a 2-party system, and the founding fathers wanted no parties for this very reason. And we've always had really 2 dominant parties, and they've evolved. Some are more dominant than another at different times. Americans don't really we say we might want united government, but we don't, because when you've got one party in charge of, say, the Senate and the House, we tend to switch that out at midterm. So we're used to that kind of movement and that kind of flow. But a realignment is when, for example, you've got factions of voters that cut across both parties. So right now, our House of Representatives is split at 222 Democrats and 213 Republicans. That's a handful of seats difference between the two. And the Senate is quite literally 50-50. I mean, it doesn't get more divided than we are right now. But the factions of voters cut across both parties. So what we saw in this election in 2020, you know, Trump, we always talk about he does a lot for his base, and he always kind of caters to his base. So what we saw were the suburbs really making a difference. And the suburbs are generally what we're calling new liberals, in that they're generally college educated, often white, socially tolerant families. They live in pretty traditional family units with family values that, you know, we can sort of all recognize as these American family values, whatever that may mean. They could be mainstream Republicans, but the Trumpist faction turns them off from that, right? They don't want to go that way. So they gave it a shot. They didn't get what they wanted out of that, certainly. So they went for Biden this time. Does that make them Democrats? I don't know. Not if Democrats are democratic socialists, because then no, that's not what they seek either. And you also, interestingly, in this election, and I promise I'll shut up, have this group of new conservatives. And this was the thing that I think surprised a lot of people. A lot of these so-called new conservatives were immigrants, people who, and if not, you know, first, then second generation immigrants who want economic freedom. They like the limited government involvement in the economy. They want the opportunities to go for it. And they're scared of democratic socialists. That's what they think that they saw in their own countries in a lot of, you know, that's why they ended up wanting to leave, because they didn't have opportunities, because that's what they see when they think of democratic socialist. So that's what makes them Trump voters the first time. But then 4 years of anti-immigrant rhetoric, anti-violent anti-immigrant rhetoric makes them very confused, and confused that enough of them switched to Biden in 2020 to give him a very narrow edge. But what if these two factions come together and form a third party and run a candidate that supports fairly traditional family values and family structures, but is tolerant of diversity in almost all forms and wants that freedom of economic opportunity? Does that candidate appeal to these new liberals and new conservatives? Does that candidate win? And if that candidate wins, what happens to the Democratic and the Democrats and Republicans as they currently stand? Because we don't have space for three parties. The rules are designed for two parties. So that's a lot. I know. I just did, but I think that's what we live through. I feel like that's what I feel. That's the angst I feel, right? In it when I watch that animation, is I really don't know what I think. I really don't like either one. I don't know where I fit in here. What does this mean for me?
Well, that ties into so well with something that's, you know, a key question for my study is why is voter turnout is so low in the United States, being the, you know, defender of democracy around the world, and you compare it to definitely to other developed nations and even to the developing South. You compare it and you see the lower voting turnaround. And is that a common fear or angst that people feel? Is that the result of the political system? If we, you know, had a different system, it's just like a scenario, imaginative scenario. If you had a different political system, would these presidents, you know, 45 of them, would they get elected? So those are some of the questions, and I think the voter turnaround is connected to exactly that feeling that a majority of people feel.
And actually, so I recently found out that in some countries, like specifically in Ecuador, you have to vote, and if not, you can be fined. And this is something I feel like Americans we really take this for granted when it's like we're the city on a shining hill, right? But I think to take it back, so what we just heard about how there are some shifting dynamics in terms of where you're located, what your background is. If we want to talk about what it perhaps means to actually be an immigrant in America, we have 2 more questions I'd really like to go to, and we are running out of time. So I was hoping we could kind of squeeze them together to talk about like who our neighbors are and who we are. So the first question, this is kind of a 2-parter, but I would love to hear everyone on the panels sort of weigh in if you feel as though you want to. But so the first part is, how can neighbors and families who hold strong oppositional viewpoints politically reconcile or even coexist? And then the second half, which is kind of a new direction for discussion, is who is allowed to define what or who an American is? Elifnaz, we're starting with you because we haven't started with you yet, so it's on you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the coexisting, right? What I heard so many times between, the election and the inauguration day is, are we going into civil war? Is this a civil war? Is this how it starts? That's a big fear, and I believe that it is. Taking back to, it's like when you examine the dynamics of modern and complex conflicts like Sri Lankans and Israel and Palestine, or Cyprus or Caucasus, there are community-based, and that's what I believe. That's why I study this. Exploring those innovative problem-solving, methods. There are options for you become partners in conflict. So if you're a conflicting party, you are actually you have a say in the game. So you want to say something, right? That makes you all of a sudden a stakeholder. That's why we call you a stakeholder in that situation. So that is in itself is a reason to come to the table. Literally, whether it's a dinner table or a conversational platform like this. So when you think through that, again, I gave that example, you have several identities. You might be fighting in one end, but if you actually want to start a conversation, you will have several identities that you can highlight to at least bring you to the table. So, and then politicians use it all the time in terms of political communication, right? They will highlight some of the nations or countries' identity. They will say, you are this religion, and then they'll play into that, but then that person can be that religion and also that nationality and that race. And sometimes this identity gets hyped up externally, usually, and sometimes this doesn't mean that you are changing as a person. You are still the same race. You're just different identity. So neighbors wise, and how you define being an American, you can be an American and global citizen. You live in the earth, you live in this universe, however you want to define it. So that's the key to finding a coexisting mechanism, I think, with neighbors. You might be moms, you might be hurt. So I'll give you a real example from a community engagement exercise that I've been a part of in Palestine. What they found in their pain in conflict, you bring women into the table, and while they weren't talking to each other because they're so hurt, they're so angry, both are moms and they lost their kids into a conflict. And through this exercise, they came to the same room and they found commonality in their pain. And then they were now leading that coexistence. So that's an example from an actual, armed conflict. And every time I hear, is this a civil war? I think of that example. You'll find commonality if you want to.
That's really powerful. Thank you for sharing that example. Yeah, just kind of if anyone else wants to weigh in on that, the theme of how to find perhaps a common ground.
So I think finding a common ground is a choice. Coexistence is a choice. And we either choose it. If we value it, it'll happen. If we don't, it won't. As we've been talking, I've been thinking about a term we use in social psych called minimal group paradigm. And research has found that something as simple as picking a star or a circle out of a hat and grouping people based on whether they picked a star or a circle, people showed in-group bias. They aligned with their group. Simply saying, you're a circle, you're in the circle group, gave them a sense of belonging to the circle group, and they started to feel such a strong belonging to their group of circles that they no longer liked the stars. Okay, the star group was their out group. And how do we break that down? How do we break down this need we have to belong that's so strong that we'll, do or say anything to stay there? And again, what research has found is we need common tasks. We need common goals. Goals, when even people from different groups, when they're working together on the same goal, much like you were sharing with the common identities, yes, we're from different places with moms, those common identities, those common goals seem to be what break down those negative group feelings towards each other. I've seen a lot recently, we aren't Democrats or Republicans, we're all Americans. And while it's a meme and it's, not meant to be so serious, the truth is if we focused on that commonality a little bit more, there would be less division.
Yeah, I mean, those are both very salient points, and thank you for sharing them. And I feel like we're just starting to run out of time, and we already have a few questions. So I hate to sort of end it there, but I think we have really good food for thought, and we can kind of use that to maybe springboard into some questions. So we had a question for Heidi from David, who wanted to know, Heidi, what kind of unexpected journey did you find yourself on as a result of the process of actually working on this project?
Hi, David. I went to high school with David. Hi, David. Hi. So I mean, I think that thinking about that question, I think that the most interesting part of the journey for me was I always like to tell stories in my artwork. Like I haven't always made animations, but I've always had pretty narrative work. But having to not know what the story was going to be, and then at first that was just like a struggle, so like something to kind of get over. But then the unexpected part was, kind of at a certain point I started seeing the story because it was unfolding in front of me, and you could kind of start to predict things, and then started making things with that kind of feeling of like, okay, and this is awful, but okay, something's going to happen January 6th. I didn't know what was going to happen January 6th. Obviously, I didn't think that was going to happen January 6th specifically, but just, having that feeling and being able to put things in that are kind of a premonition and kind of work towards something, and then, to be able to kind of flow with a story arc. It was invigorating, and it was hard, and it was painful because there were, definitely things about that I didn't want to have to respond to, and I wanted to just be able to turn it off. But it was, that was the surprising journey right there.
Had to be hard to always be switched on and always responding to that, right? Especially in such a heightened environment. I can only imagine. Speaking of an echo chamber, like it's everywhere.
Yeah.
So someone else wanted to know, I think their initials were literally just HCC, but they were asking about the role of intersectionality with identity. I think this is when we were talking about how to inhabit, say, multiple identities, and then to find a way to build a consensus on that the first time around. So does anyone want to weigh in perhaps on intersectionality, both as a form of our identities and our interactions, but then perhaps also as like a facet of American politics. Since we have such a well-rounded panel, it would be nice to hear both perspectives.
I mean, one thing that I want to say is the beauty that that intersectionality exists, right? Where when we say we want to find a common ground, we don't want to say it's a blend. The reason that it can be a lively environment around you is that because those identities exist, it doesn't mean that we are going to get rid of all those identities so that we can be in peace. That sounds boring. And frankly, I think people want, there was a worldview, at the end of Cold War when the Berlin Wall was coming down and, globalization, free trade was happening. That globalization trend, people, especially for example, on the Democratic side, they thought, oh, look at that, life without borders. And I think that world of polarized world actually now became within the country. Now we are polarized, and as US, it's everywhere. So we became, from a international polarization, we became, countries of polarization. So that still exists. I think that's because we were overly optimistic about the fact that free trade, globalization, no borders, people felt unheard. Because people that have different identities, they want to talk about, they want to identify with. And so I think that intersectionality is important and it still has to exist. And by highlighting them, we're actually finding a common ground, not by combining them.
Does anyone else want to weigh in? If not, we can move to, I felt like that was a well-rounded answer, so I will move on personally. Hi, Heidi. I wanted to ask, this is from, let's see, Bethany Schilling. She wanted to ask, how did you stay motivated? Yes, how did you stay motivated to continue on with this project through this tumultuous time in history?
Oh, Bethany, it was, deadlines are very driving for me. So I had one, I said I was going to do it. I told everybody on social media that's what I was doing. Not that I have, a huge social media following, but still I told, my whole family that's what I was doing. Like once I commit like that, then I have to do something. So I think that would be the thing that motivated me most when I just really didn't feel like it, like this was going to happen. There's no way around it. But so yeah, that's true. But, there were days that were definitely harder than others, and I sometimes had to find something really easy to do for the day, just like I can't do this right now, let me find this little quick trick I can do, and maybe it'll feed in somehow. So there are a couple things like that I think it worked out okay, but they were just kind of like, and then other days it was like, okay, I had a great idea, and oh crap, that was a 12-hour idea. And I'm also, luckily also a lot of it was on my, I teach, so it was on my break, but not all of it. November was still definitely, November and December we were still in school, so I was tired, and I knew that there was an end. That's also the other part of it.
We have another question from Gina Pierleoni. How will you restore, I think she means to say, how will you restore yourself after the heavy lift of this project? I normally crash and burn after big projects like this and deadlines, and crash and burn in a way where I'm not in a good, healthy, restorative way, in a way that I, don't make work for a long time, and it gets away from me, and I put my energy into whatever else is in my life and move on. And I committed myself to not do that this time. So I am restoring by setting some more, limited daily tasks. So I have a very small amount of time that I need to work on animations or other studio things, very loosely defined, every day, and I'm making sure to do it. And for the first time since at least before the pandemic, and possibly a lot longer, I'm taking a day off from non-art things every week, which I hope everybody
takes days off, but I swear it's been a really long time for me. So I just implemented that one. I am taking a day off every week from school-related stuff, or from most school-related stuff. I'll still answer people's texts. But yeah, and I'm not putting a lot of pressure on myself for that day to get a lot done in the art either, but I'm allowed to work on that stuff. So I think it's working. I'm still in it, but I think I'm getting through. I'm working on one of the projects that I was working on before I decided to switch to this one, and I'm not as jazzed about it because it's not as like, you know, it's not as much of a rocket ride, but it's you know, it's coming along.
So on your days off, maybe you're like halfway through like making a pot holder now. Like that's kind of the direction that you're.
Not quite like that, but yeah, that sounds good.
Actually, Dr. Holik, which I think this is a great question for the end of our panel. She wants you to ask, or sorry, she wants to ask you to tell us about your ending of the animation.
So the ending of the animation, and I did talk about that at the last event we had, because I realized if you're looking on a small screen, you can't really entirely see it. You kind of need to zoom in or look on a larger screen. But the very last, the last animation, the one from the inauguration day, is I made a charcoal drawing of recreating inauguration day. I made it the next day, but of me and my daughter and my son, and reflected in our eyes, if you can have a big enough screen to look on it, is Kamala Harris being sworn in, and that part, it was just, it was, I was crying, and you know, my daughter was comforting me, but I'm crying because I'm so happy, you know, for her. I'm so happy that that was very purely, I mean, of course there's all this relief about like Trump's not president anymore and all the other stuff, but you know, there's that moment of just like, this is such great representation for girls. This is such good representation for my son too, to see a woman being sworn in as vice president, to see a woman of color being sworn in as vice president. Like, it's not just for girls or girls of color, it's for everybody to see that and to understand that as like, this is how things are, and it's not weird, and it's not, you know, this is just how they're going to grow up now. And it just made me so happy and so overwhelmed with emotion, and yeah, it was very positive moment.
Yeah, I want to say thank you, first of all, to everyone who asked a question. Thank you, but especially thank you to all of our panelists for sharing so fully of your experiences, and also allowing space for some honest conversations to happen. And thank you, Heidi, for all of your hard work that you poured into this project, because it was not a small feat. So thank you for not only making this, but also sharing it with us. And if anyone has any further questions, I feel like a lot of you here know Heidi. You can reach out to her personally, but I think this is a good time to wrap for the evening. So I just want to say thank you once more for being here this evening on behalf of Amos Eno Gallery. Thank you, Heidi. And I hope all of you have a wonderful evening and a safe and healthy week. So thanks for joining us.